The title of the sermon is called Spiritual Cancer. Now, obviously, most of you know that Carla recently had a diagnosis of cancer, and part of this message is about that trial. So I'm going to be talking about two stories this morning. One is the trial of the story that we are going through right now. But the second part of this is going to, in a sense, be your story. And as I get into it, you'll have a little bit better understanding. And so a little bit as I get into this, obviously there's a lot of different things. And I told myself that I needed to try to do my best to do what I normally do, is become indifferent to things so that I'm not dealing with the thought or the emotion of what I've been going through with Carla. Obviously, in a way, this has put me in touch with feelings that I'd rather not want to deal with. So that being said, when Carla, I think it was on March 24th, when she got the phone call, and then she called and conferenced me in on that she found out that she did have cancer. And that was obviously something difficult for us to both deal with. But again, I want to tell part of that story. But part of that, as I do that, I'm going to ask Brad to grab these and give each one of you. These are kind of just randomly done, but each of you, as you receive it, you're going to now be receiving some bad news. All right, you are just finding out that you're receiving cancer. Now, you see two things on this. You see this not a round sphere, it's kind of a odd-shaped cell, if you will. And on that cell, and I didn't even cover a lot of the different types of cancers that were available, but your first thought as you get this is, I've heard of cancer, but what is it? What is this cancer that I now find out is in my body? And some of your first instinct is, how do I get this out of me? What is this cancer? So as I looked at this, I went online and just kind of got a definition of cancer. It refers to, and as we went through this early process, we're finding out a lot of this, but it's a large number of diseases. So virtually each and every one of you has a different cancer that I've shared with you, if you will, through Brad. Thank you. And I'll take one myself here. All right. So it's a number of different types of diseases that are characterized by development of abnormal cell. And you notice your cell isn't round or spherical in shape. It's kind of odd in shape. And what I didn't draw in there are the little receptors. And we're going to talk a little bit about those in a bit. But they're odd cells, and they have the ability to infiltrate and to destroy the normal body tissue. Cancer often has the ability to spread throughout the body. Now, as we get into part of this discussion, we're going to, a little bit later, flip over, and we're going to talk about spiritual cancer. But right now, I'm talking about the physical cancer. And it turns out that there's 4 different types of cancer, but knowing which type of cancer you're dealing with also determines a lot about how you're going to treat this. And it turns out there's carcinoma, there's sarcoma, there's lymphoma, and leukemia. And these different types of cancers are treated a little differently. And as you find out more about the cancer that you currently have in your hand, you would have to find out, how do I deal with this? Your first instinct is, get it out of me, rip it out of me, tear it out of me, cut it out of me, do whatever you have to do to get this out of me. And I think Carla initially had that sense of feeling of getting it out of her. But as I'm going to go through this, I talked about cancer and what is it. We're also going to look at why the fight. Why are we fighting against this cancer? Survival instincts, the overload that you go through, and the different possible or best courses or pathways to possibly choose. Again, it depends upon the type of cancer you have. And obviously our objective here is to become healthier again or become a survivor. So all of those I want to talk to a little bit here. So why the fight? Why do we suddenly have, when we find out we have cancer? And I don't know what cancer you each individually have. That I can tell you right now, I just pulled up mine. It says liver cancer. All right, so that's the one. Each of you has something different. And as you talk to a physician, you're going to find out there's different ways to treat or cut out or radiate these cancers. And so why do we suddenly have a sense of fight for our life in this cancer that we've got? And I think that's something that God built into us, is a sense of fight or flight. Well, unfortunately, when you have the cancer, there's no flight. You can't run away from it. And as I found out from one of the doctors that we spoke with in Arizona, the cancer is you. And I went, what does that mean, the cancer is you? And he says it's part of you. And that kind of caught me off guard. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. So as we found out this information, we had the surgery and the biopsy, which confirmed that it was cancer, because we found out first off that Carla did, through the mammogram, and then through the ultrasound, and then finally an MRI. They knew there was something there that didn't belong, but they didn't know for certain. So they had to do surgery to remove a biopsy, and that biopsy unfortunately came back positive. But the doctor's saying, well, I'm not sure that I got it all. And your first thought is, well, why didn't you? Well, there were some reasons that came into play, that he had to play it on the safe side and where he was cutting, and he had to have a second person there with him as he was starting to cut out this what we think is a foreign mass that was there. And so when we finally got the results from all that, we sat down with her surgeon, and he explained all this. And obviously he's going through this deluge of information, just an onslaught of information. And that's where part of, you have this instinct to survive, and it's a primal instinct. But when you start wanting to know more about what cancer is, it becomes difficult, because your instinct to survive is get it out of me. But they start talking to you about what this cancer is. It turns out there's different stages, and we're fortunate that hers turned out to be a stage 1 cancer, slow growing. But later, talking with my brother, he had a stage, what's called stage 3C, and it was fast growing. And he ended up having one cancer and got treated, and he thought he was clear, but sometime later he got a second cancer. So it went from I think a lung cancer, and then later to a colorectal. So it started spreading in his body, and it was aggressive. He's now 8 years in remission on his cancer. So again, depending on how they treated it and the methodology, but you're getting this ton of information from these doctors. Some of it is almost going over your head, because they're trying to bring it down into layperson language. But it's like, okay, I know all of this stuff now. How do they treat it? Now, you talk to one doctor, they're going to say, yeah, this is the best way. And you talk to a different doctor, because after the first doctor, a couple hours later, we got to go see the other doctor, and his thoughts on it were a little different. And so we're now, okay, we thought this was the best way, the best choice, and now we're finding out maybe that isn't a good choice, because now there's radiation and potentially chemotherapy involved, and then you start looking at the side effects of those. And then we go over to look at the other way, which was much more destructive in a surgery aspect, but not worrying about so much the radiation and the side effects from the radiation, which is called contracture, was one of the things that they talked to us about. And so all of these things are coming into play. So that being said, we're thinking, okay, I don't like this choice, and I don't like that choice. What other choices are there? Where else do I go? What are the options? And that's when we started to look a little bit into naturopathy. And naturopathy was another option, but we didn't know if it was a viable option yet for us. So we started again. The more we learned, the more we needed to learn more to find out what is the best way to go? What is the best path? Now, they tell you that a person going through grief goes through 5 stages as they deal with an issue. And the first of those is denial. When we first heard this bad news, and as I just gave you a piece of paper, you're thinking, no, I don't want brain cancer. I don't want to deal with, blood cancer, the leukemia, or I don't want to deal with, possibly stomach cancer, all these different types of cancers. What can I do? So your first thought is, I need to know more information about this so I can make a good choice on how to treat it and ultimately to become a survivor. But the first thought was denial. Lord, this can't be real. Really? You're giving me cancer? How am I supposed to deal with this? Carla didn't go through it, but I did, was dealing with anger. Okay, I'm at work, but the only thing that I didn't warn my supervisor, I says, don't mind me if you see me kicking things or punching at the boxes. I need to let out my anger. And obviously I'd already told her what was going on, so she understood. But that was the stage that I went through, anger. As you're looking at what you have in your hand, you might say, hey, why me? Why, there's a sense that anger coming out. The next stage oftentimes is bargaining. Okay, Lord, if you take this away, I'll be good, or I'll go to church, or I'll do whatever you want. That's the bargaining that oftentimes people go through. Then the next phase is oftentimes depression. Before you start to accept what's going on, sometimes people get depressed about it. They don't know quite how to deal with it. And I'm talking with my brother later on, he said, Chuck, 50% of what you're going to go through has to do with your attitude. And as Carla was sharing, my attitude in the beginning wasn't very good. And I tend to become disassociated or indifferent about things. And I think God has, in a way, put me in touch with my feelings in this process. Not that I wanted to be in touch with them. And even as I'm talking about it here, I push those back so that I can talk through this. But ultimately, we have to come to a point of acceptance. Okay, this is the trial that I have to go through. This is what God has presented or put in front of me. Now, in our discussion a little earlier here, we were at our Sabbath school study, we were talking about the little organisms and how fast and how rapidly they multiply. And then we started talking about sin and how that multiplies. And that's coming into my thinking process as we're looking at this body cancer. Okay, so information overload, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, ultimately having to deal with acceptance. This is real. There is no way to step around it and say, okay, this is just a bad dream, I'll wake up from it. And I can't truly speak for all of Carla's feelings because she's going through them, because she's the person that this is happening to. I can only speak from my perspective as being her partner and seeing what she's going through. So from that standpoint, we are trying to get as much information as we can so that her ultimately having to make the best choice, the best course of action. Your cancer might be different than yours, and the treatment, the choice you have to make, might be entirely different. And we're ultimately charged with that same thing. What is the best course? What is the best pathway to, or the choices? We all throughout life make good and bad choices. But ultimately, if we make a bad choice here, this could be a life. Okay, this could be, bad. Now, many of us have lost loved ones. And throughout a person's life, how we eat, how we take care of our bodies, all those are choices that we make each and every day. And ultimately, those have an effect on our life. But now we're trying to make a good choice for treatment, and so that ultimately we can get rid of this cancer. Now, I'll share with you in the process here, we I chose to kind of go public with it because a comment that Carla had made was, I wish there were more people praying for me about this. And that was, in a sense, okay, the only way I know how to reach out, because I'm not really as you know me, I'm not a touchy-feely type person, but I decided to reach out, and that day was my birthday. So I published on Facebook, the only birthday wish that I would wish today was for people to pray for my wife's health. And I think I probably counted about 40 people that responded back right away on that they were praying for her. And that to me was touching. But from that, there began to open up doors. And that's what was touching to me, in that initially when we were only seeing, we had option A, didn't like that. We have option B, really didn't like that. What else is available to us? And then Carly got a phone call. The place that we were trying to get into, we had originally contacted David Guerrero. Many of you know him. And we were talking to him a little bit about the naturopathy route. But he gave us a referral. One was in Arizona. We called them. We found out, well, from beginning to ending, maybe 5 or 6 weeks down the road, you're looking at about $75,000 to go to their oasis. And okay, that's, exorbitant. That seems outrageous. But we're thinking, okay, this is her life. How do we look at all this? And he gave us a second referral to Donna Abfall, who is down in West Bend, just next to Chicago. And then we found out, well, they have 2 offices. One is in West Bend. The other is just south down by Fond du Lac. We called there, but initially we couldn't get an in, and they were suggesting that we had to see some other group before we could even get in. Well, that seemed like that door's not open. But all of a sudden, Carly got a phone call, and they said, we've got an opening. And so we had 2 options. One was going the next day, and the other was, about 3 weeks out, I think, something like that. So I made quick arrangements, was able to take the day off. We got everything set up. We showed up there. We left here at, 5:45 in the morning. We got down there at a little before, right around 7. And there were people already, there was already, the office was open. Everything was getting started up. So we got checked in. We spent the day in the morning there till 2:30 in the afternoon when we finally left. But we learned so much. We learned so much that it was, again, that overload of information. But we're finding out what feeds cancer. All the things that we thought were safe, many of them were actually feeding her cancer. And what was one of the other doors that opened up when we were there, we had set to see the doctor that was there, and he's been in the industry for 45 years, so we realized he was fairly competent at what he's doing. But we were originally trying to see this Donna Abfall, who was the naturopathy doctor, and he says, well, wait a minute. So he goes out the door, finds out she's going to be in, and he comes back and says, well, she has a busy day, but she has a 2-hour window that's opened up. We're plugging you in. So that's why what we thought was going to be a day turned out to be a long day. But while we're there, she's got this rather expensive piece of equipment there, and we're actually looking at her blood cells. They take a little bit of blood and put it on a slide. And you can see all the good blood cells, and you can see the blood cells that don't look so healthy, the ones that are clumping together. You can see little parasites that are there that shouldn't be there. You can see this yeast that's starting to get into her body that shouldn't be there. So we're learning all this stuff, and it's like, Carla's like, oh, yeah, I don't like what I see here. She says, no, that's just one little drop of blood. And you think about the rest of your body, and you think about your lymphatic system, you think about all these other things that God has designed in your body to take care of you, but you realize some of those aren't working well. How do I make a good decision, and which is the right way to go? So again, doors started opening for us. Ultimately, we're looking at trying to become healthy again. I say we, but Carla primarily. But again, when I look at it from my perspective, the we is us. It says, that a man and woman come together and become one. And although the cancer is not in me, it's affected me directly. And that's what has been difficult for me. But in the industry, when we look at how doctors consider a survivor, anyone that makes it beyond 5 years is considered a survivor. Now, we are fortunate that we know 2 individuals, Vicki Thompson, who comes here on occasion. She's a survivor, and she's now 10 years in remission. Wendy Larson, we know Wendy. She's now 20 years a survivor. So those are some of the ones that have made it through the long run. But there are a lot of people that do not make it as a survivor. Okay, my brother was fortunate, although he's gone through 2 cancers now, is a survivor for 8 years in remission. All right, so all of this, as you see, is the story or the physical part of what we've gone through. But now I want to, if you will, flip the coin and have you look at your paper once again and look at the cancer that's there. But below that, you see where it says spiritual cancer. You have a spiritual cancer. But what is it? That is the stain that sin puts on our soul. Okay. Is it growing? Is it spreading? Some of us don't even realize that we have this spiritual cancer, and you're just now being notified, if you will, that you have it. But are we aware of it and that it's contaminating our body? And if we are aware of it, why do we sometimes wait so long to do something about it? Okay, our first instinct when we found out that she has cancer was tear it out, rip it out, cut it out, do whatever you have to do, get this thing out of me. But the question is when we sometimes are made aware that we have a spiritual cancer in our body, and sometimes it may be spreading, are we just as aggressive to get rid of it? Why the fight? I asked that question before. Why are we fighting? And what are we fighting for? We're fighting for our soul. But are we fighting as vigorously to get rid of this cancer? Are we fighting as hard as if it were a body cancer? Are we seeking guidance, counsel, or help? That was one of the first things that when we find out she had a cancer, we are trying to find out, get the best help, get the best counsel so that we can start to try to make a good decisions. In the spiritual world, if we are trying to get counsel and help, from whom? Where are we seeking out this help? Are we looking for other humans to give us the best counsel or help? Or are we seeking out God? Where do we place our trust and our hope? Are we in good hands or are we in God's hands? And that's where we sometimes need to reflect on that. Now, earlier on I mentioned this one doctor said that we are the cancer. It is actually part of us. It's part of our body. And our body doesn't recognize it as an enemy. So who is the enemy? We are the enemy. Now, we sometimes blame Satan. Satan's the enemy, right? We tend to think that Satan is the enemy. But in fact, Satan has no power but that which we give to him. He can tempt us all our life, but unless we, just like Adam and Eve did, unless we give in, he cannot force us to do anything. He can torture our body, but he cannot take the soul unless we relinquish it from him. So who's the enemy? Yes, unfortunately, we are the enemy because we are the ones that have freedom of choice. We're the ones that make the choice. But just as we're looking at the physical cancer, it could be and might be, but not necessarily is a death sentence. But when we look at sin, what is the penalty for sin? Death. We know that with sin, the stain, the corruption that gets into our soul, if you will, the penalty for sin is death. It's not a if, an or, but it's definite. Survival instinct. We talked a little bit about that before. Do we have that primal instinct to do any and everything necessary to be saved. And I look at myself, I have to reflect on myself sometimes. Am I doing any and everything necessary to be saved? I would have to say there's lots of times when I'm not. So I'm reflecting on this in light of what we're going through, but there are times when, as an individual, we have to look at that. All right, I talked about overload or information overload, and there were 5 different stages. Are we in denial, first off, that there's a problem spiritually? We might think, well, I'm a good person, and I hear that lots of Christians say that. I'm a good person, I live a good life. But are they in denial that there's actually a problem still there? And are we angry that we've allowed ourselves to get into this state or this condition? Cancer, spiritual cancer is there. And unfortunately, we were the enemy. We allowed it to come in. God didn't want us to become corrupted by this, but we chose to allow it in. Are we bargaining with God? I'll go to church if you save me. I'll do it your way if you grant me what I wish. Sometimes that's bargaining. I asked Carla, I said, when you first found out that you had cancer, did you bargain? Did you think to God, okay, God, take this away from me. I'll do whatever you want. She says, well, I thought about it, but no, I didn't go there. But in my head, I'm already thinking, I did. Lord, do whatever you have to save my wife. I'll do what you want. So that's where I started going through that same process of bargaining. Are we depressed? Have we given up the fight for survival? It's an unfortunate statistic, but because of COVID, they say someplace from 40 to 60% of people will not return back to church. They, in a sense, have given up the fight. I'm still a good Christian, but I'm not going to be in convocation. I'm not going to continue to go back to church and to be in fellowship. So it's unfortunate they've given up the fight. More and more Christians have lost their faith. Have we accepted his covenant, his grace, his sacrificial gift? We have that spiritual cancer, and only he can save us. Only the shed blood of Christ can cleanse us from our sin. Now, we have available to us the information that we need. I talked about overload before, the amount of information that we were taking in, and there's still so much more that I need to understand and to read. But there's so much that we have available to us through the Bible. And it need not be an information overload. We have the Word of God, and sometimes we don't take the time to learn truly what it is and what we need to do to be saved. The information's there. Sometimes people will read a little bit, and then they'll put their book aside. And there was a story of a girl that it's a little tale, but she turns to her mom and says, well, what's that book? And he says, well, that's the Bible. He says, that's God's book. And she stares at it for a little while, and don't you think we should give it back? We haven't used it in a long time, Okay, so sometimes that's how we are with our reading of Scripture. Do we immerse ourselves in trying to understand that God is trying to save us? He's given us the information, but it doesn't have to be an overload of information. Okay. So what's the best course? And this sometimes depends upon our choices. I talked earlier about making good and bad choices throughout life. What counsel or help are you seeking? Upon whom do you depend? Now, the Scripture tells us that wide is the path that leads to destruction. I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, but wide is the path that leads to destruction, and narrow is the way that leads to life, but few find it. And that comes from Matthew, but it's sad that so few of us are really taking the path that leads to salvation. And unfortunately, in our physical life and our spiritual life, sometimes we don't look for that narrow path, realizing, well, everybody seems to be going this way. Maybe I shouldn't be going that way, because look at what's going on in our world today. what we knew to be bad, people were saying, oh, that's okay. And what we thought was good, people are condemning. So we're starting to see that narrow path become a lot more visible. Now this might seem a little bit more like a no-brainer, but if the penalty for sin is death, why would we choose that path? We know that that is the final result of that. And as we read earlier, I can do all things through God who strengthens me. So we know that's the path that we should be looking towards. Ultimately, our aim and our goal is to become healthy again. Just as in the physical, here in the spiritual, we want to become redeemed. Okay. Earlier on, I was talking a little bit about healthy again, and we were looking at some of the choices and the costs involved with that. We want to be saved, but at what cost? But when I'm thinking here about healthy again and being redeemed, at what cost? Who paid the price? Christ paid the price. He shed his blood for us to become saved or healthy again. If our objective is to be spiritually healthy again, then you have to surrender yourself to the only one, the only physician who can save you. If you found out you had cancer and you found out there was only one physician that knew how to save you, do you think you'd be knocking on his door, pounding on his door? I know that you know what I need to be saved. And here we do know the one physician that can save us. Nothing we do can earn our salvation, but rather surrender, faith, and dependence upon God's gift. Now finally, I mentioned that 5-year, 10-year window you'd be classified as a survivor. But in the spiritual context, survival rate is 100%. Based on what? On all that place their trust in Christ, on who shed his blood. Jesus Christ shed his blood, that if we accept that gift, we talked earlier about throwing out somebody fell into the water, throwing out the lifesaver for that person. But there was something they were required to do. They had to grab the lifesaver to be saved. The same thing here. There's a 100% survival rate if you reach out and receive the gift that Christ has given for our salvation. You're not going to get 5 or 10 years, but for all of eternity. I'm no longer longing to hear those words. I do rather longing to hear those words, well done, good and faithful servant, enter into the joy of the Lord. So as we're looking at this from the physical standpoint of cancer, I invite you to look at this from the spiritual context. And only you know the cancer that might reside within you. I would invite you to be as aggressive with that as if you had just found out that the cancer that I put on a piece of paper, if that cancer was now in your body, because you would be. You would be doing any and everything you could to get rid of that cancer out of you. And now you have the opportunity to do the same in a spiritual way.